almost mindless getting there, just like we brush our teeth. But when they were there was space, openness to be creative. Now, the key is to give yourself time to create the ritual. You see, maintaining a ritual requires some self-discipline, but not a lot. Creating a ritual requires a lot of self-discipline. Once again, because we go back to our old habits. Let's do a quick exercise. So why don't you take your hands and just fold them. Fold your hands for a minute. All right. Now, continue to folding your hands, only this time in the opposite direction, meaning this hand below and this hand above. Yeah. I see especially the men are not really getting it, but it's okay. Now, how does that feel? Not comfortable, right? Now, this is such a simple movement, folding hands, and yet we feel very uncomfortable. Something is wrong here, and we want to go back to our folding before. Much more comfortable. We first make our habits, and then our habits make us. Okay. So the key is, here we're talking about a very simple change, folding hands. How much more difficult is it when we have habits that we've cultivated for many years and are much more significant in our lives? Very difficult to change them. It takes time. William James, as I mentioned before, says it takes 21 days to change a habit. Lauren Schwartz, in their book, The Powerful Engagement, talk about 30 days to change it. And of course, it depends on what habit. So give yourself 30 days to start the gratitude. Give yourself 30 days to build a new ritual of exercising regularly. And the key is to give yourself no more than 1 or 2 rituals each 30 days. Why? Because as we mentioned earlier, it takes a lot of self-discipline to create a ritual, and we don't have much self-discipline. Which is why when we have a list of 10 changes that we want to introduce in our lives today, we end up doing none. Because we're overextending our self-discipline and we break down. It takes a lot of discipline to start a ritual, but once we start it, after a month when it's habituated, when it's grooved in, when a neural pathway has begun to form, then we can move on to the next ritual and introduce it if we're ready. No more than 2, ideally 1 ritual. Next week in your response paper, you're going to choose a ritual, 2 rituals for this month that hopefully you will also introduce, because there cannot be change without behavioral change. Lauren Schwartz, incremental change is better than ambitious failure. Success feeds on itself. We see it on the individual level. We see it on the organizational level. John Cotter from the business school does a lot of work on change in organizations, in the realm of leadership. What he talks about a lot is how you need small successes and then build on these successes. One thing that happened to me, I remember when I was an undergraduate, and it happened to me my sophomore year. I played on the varsity team, didn't have a good season my sophomore year, was burnt out, got injured, and couldn't wait for the 1st of March. March 1 is the last, or March 2, sometimes the last day of the season. And I couldn't wait because after that, I could stop playing squash and focus on my studies. Then I could get a lot of work done. Because with squash, we were at the courts, training physically for 2 hours, but total 3 hours a day. Weekends we were traveling mostly or had matches at home. Mornings, at least 2 mornings a week, we were lifting weights or in the gym. So it was rough. A lot of work, and I said, I can't wait to have the freedom without squash, especially given that I wasn't enjoying it that much at that point. Can't wait not to do it anymore and just to focus on my classes, catch up on all the readings and writings and stuff. March 1 came. I stopped playing completely. And instead of becoming more productive, I became far less productive. Now, I see a lot of you nodding. The athletes know what I'm talking about. Why did I become more, or rather less productive? Procrastination. Whoa. skyrocketed. Why? Because for years I've been told that I'm a person with self-discipline. And I started to believe it. Yeah, I have a lot of self-discipline. Look at me. I train so hard. I work, when I played on the circuit 6 hours a day. That's a lot of self-discipline. And suddenly, the squash season ended, and I said, all right, let's see this discipline at work. And I wasn't getting any work done. Why? Because I gave up my rituals. You see, during the season, those of you who play varsity or are very involved in music or a club know that. When you're investing a lot in a certain organization, your time has to be ritualized. So you know that you're in practice then, or you're at the Crimson at these hours, or you're having meetings at these hours, and after that you have to go back and work because you only have 2 hours to do it and you want to get an okay night's sleep. You have rituals, and you're productive and you're creative. And suddenly the rituals go away, and you say, okay, now I'm going to work more, and the exact opposite happens. Because we have a limited amount. It was only when I came to terms with the fact that I have a limited amount of self-discipline, it's only when I came to terms with the human nature to be commanded must be obeyed, it was only then that I actually became productive again, because I created new rituals in my life after that. Rituals, very important and significant. The only way for lasting change. Let me talk about cognition now, the C. So we talked about affect, emotions, we talked about behavior, how important that is, both acute and gradual. Let's talk about cognition. We'll talk again about cognitive reconstruction, which is the gradual way of bringing about change. And then we'll talk about the faster way of bringing about change, which is the eureka experience, the aha moment. So first, cognitive reconstruction. As we mentioned before, an interpretation is a neural pathway. If I interpret the world as a fault finder, the fortified neural pathways in my brain are the negative ones. There's an experience, and I go immediately to the negative interpretation, and that gets reinforced over time. If I am a merit finder, I will look at the exact same experiences and interpret them very differently, because I have different neural pathways in the brain. And of course, there are consequences to how we interpret our experiences. Not necessarily as things happening for the best, but as a benefit finder, I changed that. As a benefit finder, looking more at the positive with each experience. Now remember the study on the identical twins and how much genes actually matter. But they only account for 50% of the variance. So here is a story that's told in many intro to psych textbooks. And it's about twins who were raised in the same home, and their father was abusive toward them, toward their mother. He was very often drunk, very often on drugs, and really an awful, awful childhood. The worst you can imagine. And these twins grow up in that home with that father, and they go off, they leave the home, run away from home later on in life, and they reach the age of 30. And then at the age of 30, a psychologist who's doing research on twins goes and visits them. And he goes to the first twin, and what he sees there, the twin is in a relationship, he's abusing his family, very often drunk, very often on drugs. Then the psychologist is able to find him in a moment of soberness and says to the twin, "What's going on? What are you doing? What's happening here?" And the twin, who knows that the psychologist is doing research on the effect of genes and the effect of upbringing, says, "You know my father. I mean, you know the kind of childhood that I endured. How do you expect me to be any other way? And the psychologist who knows the effect of upbringing shrugs. And then he goes to the second twin. The second twin happens to be the exact same age as the first one. He goes to the second twin, also 30 years old, walks into the house and cannot believe his eyes. Such peace, such equanimity, such love between him and his wife and the kids. He's doing well in his career, doing well with his family. He comes back again after a while. See, maybe there was a fluke. Maybe he's putting on a show. But no, it's the real thing. Phenomenal family life, phenomenal professional life. And he goes to him and says, in disbelief, how? Now, that twin also knows that he's doing research, and he says, what do you mean how? You know my father. You know how I was raised. You know what he did to us. How do you expect me to be any other way? I know how much he hurt us. How do you expect me to be any other way like him? Same experiences, monozygotic twins, same genes, radically different interpretation. One continuing the hell that he endured as a child, the other creating a heaven. All because of interpretation. What do you do with it? Well, I have no choice. This is the way I was raised. This is the model. Passive victim. The other, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to be like my father. Active agent. So much of it is a matter of interpretation. Happiness, well-being, as we've mentioned many times before, is not so much contingent on external circumstances, not so much contingent on our status or the state of our bank account. It's contingent on our state of mind. The thing to remember, though, is that there are no shortcuts, unfortunately. There are no quick fixes, unfortunately. If there were, I promise you, I would have told you. If I find out next week about a shortcut, even if it's over spring break, you'll get an email from me. But I don't think there are. And very often the hope of finding a quick fix leads to more unhappiness. Here are some examples of cognitive reconstruction. This is work done by Tomaka on whether we perceive an activity as a challenge or as a threat, because we can perceive the exact same activity and cognitively reconstruct our understanding of it. So let me give you an example. When after being thrown out of Cambridge, I applied for PhD programs. One of the programs I applied to was here, was hoping to get in. And when I got in, wanted to come back, because overall I had a very good experience here as an undergrad, with all the difficulties and hardship. I was glad, wanted to be back. And when I got in, I suddenly became a little bit concerned, because I said, I experienced a lot of anxiety as an undergrad. A lot of anxiety as an undergrad. And I said, I don't want to relive that again. Maybe I should go elsewhere. And then I turned it around and I said, okay, instead of looking at Harvard as a threat to me, to my calm, I'm going to look at it as a challenge. And my challenge became explicitly, I wrote it in my journal, wrote about it, thought about it a lot, explicitly. My goal over the 6 years that I got my PhD was to maintain calm, because I said to myself, if I can maintain calm at Harvard, I can maintain calm anywhere. And I worked on it. I really worked on it. And it became a challenge. And just that change helped me get so much more out of my experience here as a graduate student. Even through the hardships, the generals and the failures and the anxiety. But overall, a much better experience. Recently, I just did it. So, once in a while I travel right after class. So 3 weeks ago, I traveled to Florida. And I had a very important talk there with a company that I really wanted to work with. It was my first event there, a company that I cared about, that I think is doing fantastic things around the world, and I really wanted to do well. And and I felt a lot of anxiety before that talk. And then I cognitively reconstructed it. I said, okay, it's anxiety-inducing, permission to be human, experience the experience, but let's look at it as a challenge. That I have this wonderful opportunity to speak to such a great company, such wonderful people. I'm going to make the best of it. Turned it from a threat into a challenge, into an opportunity. And that made a big difference in my approach to it. Think about areas in your life. What is it? Is it a play you want to try out for? Is it someone you want to ask out? Is it speaking up in section? This is studied. Those who took Psych 1 or Psych 15 have encountered that. The work of Schechter and Singer back in the early 60s. Today they would never be able to get this past the ethics committee, just like Milgram wouldn't have been able to get his study passed. Here is what they did. So they brought people into the experiment and injected them with epinephrine. Epinephrine arouses the body. It shots of adrenaline. But they thought it was just vitamin C. They didn't know it was epinephrine. And then they were sitting in the experiment, waiting for, again, the real experiment. They were sitting in the waiting room. And while they were sitting, they were asked to fill out a questionnaire. Now remember, they just got a shot of adrenaline, but they didn't know that they got a shot of adrenaline. So they're sitting, filling in a questionnaire, and in the first condition, the questionnaire had very provocative questions, to say the least. For example, one of these questions was, so how many men did your mom sleep with before she got married to your dad? That's one of the questions. You know, they would never be able to get away with this study today, but, you know, back in the 60s. So they were answered this. Now next to them, there is a confederate, someone whom they don't know is part of the study, and this guy is going ballistic. How dare they, really getting angry, and then you get angry too. And you get even angrier than the control group who went through the exact same thing except for the fact that they didn't get the injection. So what they did was they saw their bodies as getting very aroused, and they interpreted this arousal as, oh, I must be really angry. And they really did get even angrier than they would have. I mean, they got angry in the control group as well, but less angry than those who were injected the epinephrine. Now, second condition. Also injected, had a questionnaire without any provocative questions, and next to them there was again a confederate whom they thought was also doing the experiment, and that confederate found, by happenstance, a hula hoop on the floor and started to shake it, and dance and, was going crazy there and happy and laughing. And the person who was just injected the epinephrine went wild. So happy and joyous, much more happy than the control group who were in a room with a person dancing with a hula hoop but did not get the injection. In other words, he interpreted the raise in adrenaline, oh, I must be really happy now. And they were really happier. In other words, very often it's the interpretation, in this case, of a physical symptom that determines what we will feel, joy or anger, because they're quite similar. In both of them, there is an adrenaline rush. So how do we interpret a situation as arousal or as euphoria or as anger? Here's another study. This is done by Lee Ross and his colleagues. They asked people, college students, he's from Stanford, college students, to volunteer their most generous and benevolent friends, to name them, and their most competitive, cutthroat friends, and tell them who they are. And then they contacted them to be part of a study. And what they wanted to see was their behavior in a situation, in a game, where you can cooperate or you can be competitive. The intervention was that these students were randomly divided into two groups. And in the two groups, there were people who were deemed very competitive or people who were deemed very generous and benevolent. And in the second group, same thing. Half of the people were very generous and benevolent. Half of the people were very competitive and cutthroat, as perceived by their friends. And in the first group, they got a game, and the game was called the community game. And the second group got the exact same game, a game where you had the opportunity either to cooperate or to compete. But the game, instead of a community game, even though it was the exact same game, it was called Wall Street game. And they wanted to see how many people cooperate versus how many people compete. And they wanted to see what predicts it. Well, whether the participants were deemed cooperative or competitive predicted nothing. Nothing. Whether or not they would compete or cooperate. What predicted everything was whether they were in the community game or in the Wall Street game. If they were in the community game, they were much more likely to cooperate. If they were in the Wall Street game, whether they were generous, benevolent, or cutthroat competitive, they were much more likely to be cutthroat competitive. In other words, how we frame a situation, community, Wall Street, can make all the difference. Threat, opportunity, maybe the exact same thing. How we frame it can make all the difference. This is a study done by one of my ex-students, Lisa Leroux, who asked herself a very important question. Remember, questions begin a quest. A very important question, which is, how can we raise the level of volunteerism at Harvard and beyond? And the wonderful answer that she came up with is, let's get students, as well as people in society at large, to reframe how we look at volunteering rather than as duty, something, I have to do that is hard. Why don't I look at it as a privilege? I have the privilege of helping, and it is a real privilege. Remember the study on kindness, one of the best interventions for well-being. It is a real privilege to give, to help. And when people reframe this, they're much more likely to volunteer. This has implications for child rearing. This has implications, of course, for education. It has implications for society as a whole. This is a topic that I'm going to talk about a lot. I'm going to dedicate much time to it when we discuss relationships. But just very briefly, this understanding, for me, literally transformed my relationship with my wife. It transformed and is transforming my relationship with my friends as well as students and colleagues. You see, we go into a relationship, most people think that the important thing about relationship is that we're validated, that we get pats on our back. Now, that's important in a relationship. Surely it's important to be validated in any relationship, whether it's with, student-teacher, whether it's with friends, certainly in a romantic relationship. However, what David Schnark talks about is that primarily, if we want long-term, successful, thriving, passionate relationships, the first objective, the primary objective, is to go into the relationship to be known. To be known rather than to be validated. Meaning, going in there and saying, okay, so how can my partner get to know me even better? Doing it gradually, of course. On the first date, you don't want to reveal all your secrets. Doing it gradually, thinking about it, but opening up more and more. And couples who over time open up more and more are able to sustain the relationship as well as their passion over time. And again, I'm going to talk about it much more. I'm going to devote 2 classes at least to relationships. This is going to be one of the central pillars of successful long-term relationships. Also with students, the same applies. When I initially started to teach, I really wanted the validation from the students. So how can I have my students perceive me as, as a good teacher? I want them to like me. And, that's important for everyone. We all like to be liked. However, when I switched my focus, and I said, yeah, I still want to be liked, but my main focus is I want my students to know me. I want them to know the topic that I'm most passionate about in the world. That really changed a lot. It was no longer to be validated, i.e. to appear perfect, but it was to be known as a human being, of course, permission to be human. And that actually improved my teaching a great deal, and I enjoy it so much more because there's so much less pressure on us in a relationship, any relationship, when we go in with the intention of being known, of expressing rather than impressing. We can feel so much lighter. And the wonderful thing is that it also makes the relationship so much healthier. But again, much more on that because it's so important topic. We talked about this a lot. How do we perceive failure? As a stumbling block, as a catastrophe, or as an opportunity, as a growth experience? And that can make all the difference. We'll talk about it after spring break when we discuss perfectionism and the fear of failure. And finally, the study that you read by Ali Crum and Alan Langer. So just to give you a little bit of background about this study, and I will briefly mention it because hopefully you've read it already. Ali Crum was my student since her freshman year. I was her TF when I taught with Phil Stone, and then I was her thesis advisor with Alan Langer. And this was the topic of her thesis. When Alan Langer came up with the idea for the thesis, and she told Ali and me, this is what I think would be a very interesting study, I took Alan aside after the study, after the meeting, after Ali went away, and I told her, Alan, I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair that Ali will do her thesis on it, because the thesis is it's a very tough experiment. You'll hear about it if you haven't read about it in a minute. It will take a lot of time from her. She's not going to get any results. Now, you can write a senior thesis with getting a null result, without getting a result. That's okay. But I said, why waste her time, her senior year? And she said to me, it will work. I said to her, no, it won't. And boy, did it work. I've learned since then not to argue with Ellen Langer because she has ideas that you would never think work, but they do. Like the study we mentioned with the 1979 going back to 1959, or with the eye test being simply in a flight simulator improves your eyesight. Again, ideas that seem fantastic, but she proves them right. So the same happened here with this study. The study was that Ellie went to hotels and worked with the ladies who were cleaning the hotels. And she went to them, to two groups, and told both groups the importance of physical exercise. And she said, this is, something brought to you by your hotel, just to show you, to help you how important exercise is. And then she tested them on all these physical measures, whether it was body fat, blood sample, how much fat they had in their blood, weight, psychological measures, depression, anxiety, and so on and so on. And what she did was, to the one group, she just left them after all these tests. The second group, she said to them, and this was the intervention, the work that you're doing is actually physical exercise. And she calculated how much calories it takes, to pick up sheets, to go like this, and then to put it on the bed. How much calories it takes to actually vacuum. She estimated all those things. And then she gave them the statistics of how many calories you should expend a day doing exercise. And she said, what you're doing is working out, actually. This was the intervention. And she went back 8 weeks later. 8 weeks later, she ran the exact same tests again. And some of the results that she found, some of them are in the article, others are not. Blood pressure decreased significantly. The fat in the blood decreased significantly. Body weight after the 8 weeks for the intervention group, not for the control group. Control group, no change over that period. Body weight decreased significantly. Their self-esteem went up. Depression levels went down. Anxiety levels went down. And energy levels went up. All as a result. Now, she asked, did you do anything differently? Are you exercising more than you did before? No difference between the control group and the intervention group. The only difference was perception. Now, they may have worked harder. We don't know. It may be just the mind over body. We don't know. But the fact is, because they reframed, they reconstructed their experience from a chore, I have to, clean 30 rooms a day, to this is exercise and it's good for me, that made all the difference. Physically as well as psychologically. Here is an example of acute change. This is change that happens like a sledgehammer. And this is the eureka experience. There's a lot of talk, a lot of research, a lot of interest in this area of the eureka experience, the aha moment, the insight, so valuable, so important. And there is much misunderstanding about it. Because people think we suddenly have this insight. Not so. There's a whole process involved. And the process begins with immersion. This is when we prepare for the insight. This is when we learn. Howard Gardner has done a lot of work on extraordinary individuals throughout the world. And what he found is that generally, for people to become experts in a field, to become capital C creative in a field, they have to have invested in it at least 10 years of very hard work. This is the preparation. This is when you immerse yourself in the material. Look, for example, at Beethoven. Those of you who listen to his music and know the trajectory. Symphony 1 and 2, Mozart. Sounds very similar to Mozart. Third Symphony, Eroica, it's Beethoven. He immersed himself a great deal in the music of the day, studied it, learned it. And then, after many years, was able to become Beethoven and creative and transform the whole field of music, being one of the first romantics. Second stage, after we prepare, and it takes, again, a lot of hard work, whether it's preparation that was done by Bill Gates when he was skipping class, or whether it's Bill Clinton, a lot of preparation before you become an expert in a field and are able to introduce, create capital C, creativity. Have that eureka, the insight. Second stage is incubation. And you sit with all the creative individuals. After you immerse yourself in an area, you do nothing. You just allow it to marinate. For example, it's no coincidence that we get some of our best ideas in the shower. It's no coincidence that Archimedes got his best idea in the bath. Mozart used to spend hours a day just driving around Salzburg. And then suddenly he would have the aha experience, the eureka. And he said, I could hear the symphony in a second. In a second he could hear just about everything. Okay, so that's Mozart. But you hear Shakespeare would spend hours driving around in his carriage, and then suddenly would have the insight, okay, so this is what the story is about. And then he would go on and write it. The incubation stage, so important. J.P. Morgan. I can do a year's work in 9 months, but not in 12. J.P. Morgan understood, arguably the greatest entrepreneur this country has ever seen, understood the importance for creativity of taking time off. Today, business people, leaders, don't take enough time off because we think it's a waste of time. We think that if we just sit there and do nothing, we're really doing nothing. Well, no, the mind works. The mind works and the mind needs it for the creative insight. In fact, leaders, I know many of you will go into leadership positions, need time off more than anyone else because they need to be creative. They need to think about the next thing for the company, for the organization. Taking time invaluable, not just for memory, also for creativity. One of the things that I do when I work as a consultant in organizations is I just take the management on a retreat with no agenda. We're just going to hang out. And very often, within as little as half hour or an hour, ideas begin to come out. Why? Because for the first time they have time. No coincidence that we often wake up with a solution to a problem we had, because the subconscious mind is making connections then. Joseph Campbell. You must have a room or a certain hour or so a day, when you don't know what was in the newspapers that morning. You don't know who your friends are. You don't know what you owe anybody. You don't know what anybody owes you. This is a place where you can simply experience and bring forth what you are and what you might be. This is the place of creative incubation. At first, you may find that nothing happens there, but if you have such a sacred place and use it, something eventually will happen. And very often it's during these incubation times, during these time-ins, during those times when you have an opportunity to reflect, whether it's on a response paper or just hang out and listen to music, that's very often when the aha moment comes, the eureka experience, the 1 second I see the symphony. You know, in some way you can think about an analogy of how this happens. You can think about stage 1, or you can think about it in the context of sexual intercourse, of making love. Preparation and incubation can be the equivalent to foreplay. The eureka experience, the orgasm. Now, the important thing to understand about this process is you have to go through preparation and incubation to get to the eureka experience. In other words, you need the foreplay. Did you hear that, men? You need the foreplay to get to the next level. It's important. It's part of the creative process. It's significant. It's very significant for love. It's significant also for this process. And then afterwards, after you've come up with the eureka, that's when you evaluate and you ask yourself, is this a good idea? Does it work? Or is it just something that, you know, a whim and most ideas, most eureka experiences actually end up not working. And therefore evaluation is important. Is this really a good piece? Is this really a good idea for the story? Shakespeare asked. Is this really a good idea for a philosophical treatise? Descartes, who spent a lot of time on his own reflecting. Is this a really good idea for a philosophical treatise? Is this a good business plan? Is this the next Facebook? Or is it just something that I had, you know, an idea that I had at 3 a.m. in the morning and someone has already done it, or it won't work? Evaluation is important. There are many ideas out there. Not all of them work. Or to go back to our analogy of making love. So you have the first stage, the foreplay, you have the orgasm, and afterwards, here is the question that you may be asking when you evaluate it. So, do you know who they are? I mean, not the parents. Do the students know who? Do you recognize them? The Shirelles. The Shirelles. Actually, my favorite group. Really, my daughter's name, some of you know, is Shirelle, and we were looking for a name that would make sense in Hebrew as well as in English, and my wife came up with the name Shirelle, and which means in Hebrew "song of God," and then you have the Shirelles. So it was just when we found out that, it was just the perfect name. You know what I love so much about it? You can see, you know, the naivete in the dance. I love that era. Just love it. Just love it. Anyway, go on YouTube and do the Shirelles. You'll see other songs by them. So this is when you evaluate. We're almost done. This is when you evaluate. Is this something that will last? Is this something that is real? A really good idea, a really good relationship, for example. And after that, and this doesn't have a parallel to lovemaking, you elaborate. You elaborate on the idea. So you write out the symphony. This is when you write out the treatise. This is when you make the business plan. When I put together this course, I went through this process. So I started off by preparing. So even though I had very good preparation before, I studying for the generals twice, teaching with Professor Philip Stone, I was his TA twice, TF. Even though I studied social psychology for many years and had read, I took time off where I immersed myself in positive psychology material. I read the Handbook of Positive Psychology, which is a very good weapon to use. If anyone comes close, you can just throw it at them. It's about this big, but very good. I read hundreds of academic journal articles. And then I took time off. And during that time off, I talked about positive psychology, but I didn't work in positive psychology. I had conversations with my wife, with Phil Stone, with my brother about this. And that's when the eurekas came. That's when the insights came. And I said, okay, so this is how the course is going to be built. This is the spiral. Then I had the idea of the PPEO, Post-Peak Experience Order, as an idea, aha moment. And afterwards, I evaluated. I evaluated myself. I evaluated by talking to other people about it to see if it works. And then I sat down and spent hours and hours and hours writing out the lectures. All my lectures are written out. Now, obviously, I don't read them. But in preparation, when I prepare for the lectures, I do read them a few times. That was the elaboration. That is the creative process, whether it's of putting together a class, of putting together a great organization, of writing a great book, or of creating a great relationship. I'll see you next week. Have a wonderful weekend.